Okay, we pick up today with the Hellenic Civilization. As you remember from the last video, we talked about how Homer was trying to bring about the classic, or bring about the glory of Greece. And so I said that we actually get that accomplished in the Hellenic civilizations. And during the Hellenic civilization is when we're really going to see the development of the Greek city-states as they were. So they developed into what are called polises, and a polis is a little state, but it's small, but it's also independent. They're autonomous. They don't have to depend on anybody else. They are able to do what they want. And each of these polises had towns within them. Each of these towns were political and social and religious centers for their area. And typically, at least one of the towns would be the head town of the polis. It would be like their capital in a way. And in this capital city, they would have an acropolis. And an acropolis is a hill where they could take refuge. So if they were ever in battle, you want to be on top of the hill. That's where you would go. And so every polis had at least one acropolis where you could go in case of battle, where you would be protected and the military could surround it and make sure that you were safe. Also, each capital city had an agora, which was a market that was used. It's an open market. It could also be used for assembly purposes if you needed to get everybody in town together to talk to them about whatever the issue was. But typically in these polises in the Hellenic civilization, you had people who were considered citizens and you had people who were considered non-citizens. Now the citizens were adult males. Adult males could vote. They were able to have a say in the government. Citizens also were the adult females. And unfortunately, the women were not able to vote. So the males could, but the females couldn't, and adult males and females were citizens. Now, non-citizens were children, they were slaves, and foreigners, people who came there from other areas or other countries. They were not able to vote, they were not given citizen rights, but they did have certain rights and responsibilities themselves, that their job was to obey and to protect the polis. Since you're enjoying its protection, you should help to protect it as well to make sure it's safe. And so basically the polises were united. Typically they were united around some sort of local patriotism, that they picked a god or a goddess from the Greek mythology or Greek religion that they would basically select as their own and support and pray to. But the polises altogether were not unified, but the polis individually were unified. So within the polis you had a unified people, but this 6 or 7 polises were not unified to think of themselves as Greek. They didn't see it that way. They saw themselves as their own polis. There's a lot of mutual suspicion between the polises, but they do share cultural things, as well as the same language and the same religion. So that helps to unify them, that they do have that in common. But typically, they didn't always get along. So it's kind of like in a family. You all share the same genes, but you don't always have to get along. You still fight over who gets the bathroom first and that kind of thing. So it's kind of that same mentality. The military was fairly common to all the polises. Their main unit that they would use is called a hoplite, and a hoplite is a unit made up of infantrymen, and the hoplites would use a strategy called a phalanx. And a phalanx is both a defensive and offensive strategy that could be used in warfare. And basically it's a tight-knit group, and you're going to be watching a video that tells you more about this phalanx and the hoplite and how they formed up. But basically in this phalanx it took a lot of courage, and it took a lot of honor. Honor was very important because you had to trust your brother soldier to hold up his end and to not fall in battle. So that's going to make this phalanx and the hoplite very much a force to be reckoned with. Now, some polises do it better than others. For example, Sparta, and we're going to talk about Sparta in just a little bit. So there's the military. The government was also something kind of common to all the polises, but they all had different kinds of government, lots of different types. It depended on the city-state. In some, you will have a monarchy, which is where they're ruled by a king or a queen, kind of like Troy, which we talked about, or the Mycenaeans. Others will have an oligarchy, where only a few people have all the power. So it's kind of like your upper class have the power. And then some of them will have a democracy, where the people have the power, where the people have the ability to vote on everything. So that's kind of where the Greeks are at this point in history. Now, eventually, these polises get a little overpopulated, and so they begin to colonize. And the colonization is just that they're going to re-inhabit the islands there's tons of islands in the Greek peninsula. So they're going to send people out to these little islands. Basically for two reasons. Number one, overpopulation. So it resulted from overpopulation. They just wanted to get rid of some of their population. But also, a lot of times it was the rich making these decisions. And so they were sending the poor away because they were afraid that the poor would rise up against them. So get rid of the problem. Go send them to the islands. They can make a living for themselves, kind of thing. Give them a challenge and see if they can rise to it. And actually they do. These island nations that they colonize are going to become very, very rich from trade and from industry. So each colony had a polis that sent them out, but they don't have to listen to the polis that sent them out. They create their own government on these islands. So they become trading posts. Some of the islands have very good agricultural lands, and so that's why these islands were needed so much for trade, but they also needed badly to grow grain. They were getting overpopulated on the mainland, and so they needed these islands to grow food so that they could buy it from them and continue to survive. And so that's going to create a new class of people called tyrants. And the tyrants were these newly rich people. Typically, they had been the people who were poor that were sent to these islands, and so they were newly rich, but they don't have a whole lot of political power. They had tons of money, but not a lot of political power. And so they're going to be able to provide new support by being able to hire mercenaries. So anytime there's a war and you need to have some extra soldiers, you go to the tyrants and ask, can you fund me some money so that I can purchase extra soldiers? So that's possible. That was a way that they benefited. And they also benefited by doing a lot of things for the poor, because a lot of times that's where they came from. So they wanted to help out their fellow poor people, or their roots. They were going back to their roots. And they also helped to fund a lot of public works like bridges and dams and sewer systems and all that kind of stuff. So they were very, very influential, but not a lot of political power, which is going to be a key issue later on. So, like I said, we're going to talk about Sparta, and we're also going to talk about Athens as two separate polises and how they operated within the Greek civilization. Now, Sparta is the polis, so that's the city-state, and they are very much hung up on three things: stability, conformity, and order. They're very hungry for land. They're kind of a small polis. They need to be able to expand. And so they decide that they're not going to do this colony thing, because the colonies end up not listening to the original polis anyway. So they're just going to conquer. So they're going to make war on people in order to get more land. And so the first people that they're going to, or one of the main people that they're going to make war on is a little polis called Messenia. And so Spartans beat them up and they defeat them, and the Messenians become helots. And a helot is a serf, which is basically slaves that are owned by the polis. They're not owned by individuals. They're owned by the state. So there was no chance of them ever becoming free. It's free labor. You can't pass that up. So in the 7th century, the Messenians are going to say, okay, enough's enough, and they revolt against the Spartans, and they almost win. And that is a huge wake-up call to the Spartans that, oh my gosh, we can't go and conquer people if we can't keep control of them the entire time. And so the Messenians' revolt is going to be eventually crushed, but at that point, the Spartans decide to become a military state. That's when they make that decision that we cannot allow this to happen again. And so they're going to follow their leader, who at this time was Lycurgus, and Lycurgus is going to pass a series of reforms that are going to organize Spartan citizens' lives. So what they do is they decide, well, boys and girls, we have to figure out what to do with them. At birth, boys, they would, when they were born, decide whether they would live or not. So they're going to look at this little baby and decide, is there any deformities? Does it look like it's going to be able to survive? And it's examined by an official, and the official makes this determination. And if they decide that this baby's not going to make it, they go leave it on a mountainside to die. And so kind of a harsh life just to begin with, to decide if you're going to live or die or not. So that's what happens at birth. So you can live with your family until you're about 7 years old, and then at 7 years you are removed from your family to go live in the military barracks, where you go through hard exercise. You have to follow a very hard discipline. You don't get very much to eat. In fact, it's encouraged that you steal from others. And so that's what you do until you are 20. When you are 20, you officially enter the military, and you are now a soldier at that point. And so you've been a soldier, basically. You've been living a soldier's life, basically, since the age of 7. But now you're officially a soldier. At 20, you are also married. And so you are expected to produce children for the Spartan military. At the age of 30, after 10 years of serving in the military, you can now vote. And you can also leave the barracks. You can go and live with your wife and continue to make babies. Then by the age of 60, you can retire. Most Spartan soldiers do not even make it to the age of 60, but that was kind of a bonus, kind of a perk. So that's the boys' lives. What was the girls' lives like? Well, girls, same thing. At birth, they decide whether you live or not. So again, harsh decisions to be made. At the age of 7, girls were also removed, and they went to the women's barracks, where they exercised and they strengthened their bodies and learned how to keep a household and all that kind of stuff. But basically, it was to make them strong enough that they could produce healthy sons, because you need sons for the military. At the age of 20, girls were also married, and at that point, they left the barracks to go keep house for their husband, who wouldn't be living at home for another 10 years, but you're going to be raising the kids. And so that was your life until you died. That's what you did. While this sounds kind of harsh, what's really interesting is that Greek women actually had the most freedom of any women in the world at this particular time. They had to obey their fathers or husbands, so the males in their lives, but they had the right to inherit property, which other women in other civilizations did not have that ability. And when the men, while their menfolk were in the military, it was left to the women to run the family estates. It was their job to make decisions about what money's going to be spent on things, and what property they're going to own. They ran the household, all kinds of stuff. And so this is going to lead into a lot of strength for the Spartans. They have a very, very good military, but they don't want to change. So they have strength without change. They don't want change. In fact, they discouraged foreigners from living in Sparta. They said that Spartans shouldn't travel. There's no need for them to travel. Trade is very limited. They don't want strange new ideas coming into their community and disrupting things. And so they're going to discourage things like philosophy, of thinking, bigger questions like what would gods want, and that kind of thing. They discourage literature and the arts, because that's a waste of time when you're supposed to be a soldier or making little soldiers. And so they're going to spread stability and order all over the Peloponnesian Peninsula. They're going to conquer people around them, and what they're going to do is they're going to eventually create this organization or an alliance called the Peloponnesian League. And it's a military alliance, but it's a military alliance that's held through fear and strength, because it's an alliance because other people are working with them, but they're only working with them so they don't get attacked. And so that is going to make them very different from the Athenians. And we're going to get into them in just a little bit.